Sean Parnell is a retired Army infantry captain and fought in Afghanistan. Sean, how are you, my friend?
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it. I'd be doing a lot better if Joe Biden didn't completely botch 20 years in Afghanistan.
One of the things, Sean, that's bothering me is I see the effort to exploit this by various political factions, including the isolationists, the neo-Marxists. We should never have been there. And some. Obviously, we weren't seeking a war in Afghanistan. And I would argue, I had retired Colonel Richard Kemp. You probably know who he was, commander of British forces in Afghanistan for a while. I had Tom Cotton on, and I wanted you on, too, for your perspective. I mean, at the end here, we actually had 2,500 non-combat troops, CIA intel, and air power. And both of those men said to me, the Afghanis actually did fight. They lost 50,000 men. But when you pull their air power, you pull their intel, you pull the federal contractors, and you do it all in a period of a few months, then you leave our major base, and you don't even let them know you're doing it in the middle of the night. That is a problem for them. What do you say about that?
That's exactly right. I mean, Mark, there were so many unbelievably grave strategic blunders that will likely be studied at military academies for the next 50 years about how not to conduct an exfil. I mean, the Afghan National Army was structured very similar to ours in that ground power is augmented with air power. But when Joe Biden pulled out their contractors that serviced their aircraft, he effectively decimated their air force. And so early on in this Taliban offensive, the Afghan National Army were actually fighting back. But when they saw that they had no air support and likely no American support, I think they just threw their hands up and said it's not worth it. The next question I have, and I really would like to know who's responsible for this decision, and I think it's President Biden, is who made the decision to abandon Bagram Air Base before all of our American citizens and allies could be evacuated out of the country.
It's shocking.
It's one of the greatest strategic blunders in America in the last century. Mark, there are only a few airstrips in Afghanistan where you can actually land a plane. The Taliban control Kandahar. The Taliban control Bagram now, and Kabul is almost overrun. So how exactly – it's not just as simple as sending 5,000 or 6,000 more troops back into Afghanistan because we don't necessarily have a foothold to do it. And all of this, every bit of it, is laid right at the feet of Joe Biden. We killed bin Laden. The Taliban and al-Qaeda were absolutely decimated. We had almost a decade to plan an effective withdrawal, and it was completely destroyed in 7 months of the Biden administration. It's just shameful.
And Sean Parnell, we just threw 20 years away. As a matter of fact, as I pointed out, I'm not the only one. The Taliban now control more of Afghanistan than they did prior to 9/11. Now every terrorist group conceivable, assuming they get along with the Taliban, now have a massive country from which to operate, in addition to Iran. And they're going to work closely, it appears, with the Communist Chinese, and if Russia can, work with the Russians and clearly the Iranians. And Colonel Kemp said, I'm worried about Pakistan, that Pakistan could fall and they have nuclear weapons. What do you think about all this?
I totally agree. And the fact that Joe Biden, in his 7 months as president, Mark, has not even engaged a single regional ally. For example, hasn't even talked to the prime minister of Pakistan yet. I mean, you'd think that's kind of an important part of an exfiltration strategy of Afghanistan, given that Afghanistan and Pakistan share a border. But what completely disgusted me, and I think it just shows and highlights and underscores how disengaged Joe Biden has been, is that the guy pops his head up after 3-4 days of silence and essentially blames President Trump. Well, as a former military ground combat leader, one of the things that they train you, Mark, is that commanders are responsible for everything that happens or fails to happen under their command. Joe Biden is responsible for this, and he was desperate to be different from Trump in almost every way, from his border policy to his economic policy to his withdrawal from Afghanistan. And him moving the withdrawal date from May back to September 11th for strictly political reasons. There were no national security reasons as to why he did that. Really just gave the Taliban the momentum, the time, the space, the energy to consolidate and organize a counteroffensive. And, oh, by the way, they happened to take a trip to China in between. And so it's when you say that we threw 20 years away, it's true. And it's tragic because tens of thousands of Americans fought and bled in that country to give the Afghans a shot at freedom. And that's why I've been going all around, Mark, and saying, hey, look, this is not on the boots, it's on the suits. It's on the politicians who ironically enough, Mark, we've won almost every military battle on the ground, but have essentially lost the war because of our politicians.
Tell us briefly, and you have in other forms, your experience in Afghanistan with the Afghan people.
Yeah. So I was a young sophomore, elementary education major, trying to figure out how the heck I was going to student teach second grade. Towers came down. I don't come from a long line of military generals, but I got in the fight, went to Afghanistan, served along the Afghan-Pakistan border for 485 days with a mission to find Osama bin Laden. Unfortunately, we didn't find him, but we found thousands of enemy troops. My platoon took an 85% casualty rate. Some of my men were wounded twice. I think so one of my guys was wounded three times, and I was wounded as well. And so we served. We cared a lot about the Afghan people. We did everything that we could to give them a shot at freedom, protect their women and children, and just really fight for that country.
Did you make good friends over there?
The Afghan people, by and large, on the border, yeah. I feel like the Afghan National Army that we served with was courageous. But the problem with Afghanistan is that it's inherently tribal and corrupt. And so while the soldiers were courageous that we served with, you couldn't get them paid, you couldn't get them food, you couldn't get them water. And so effectively you just have a bunch of troops out there with rifles who can only last about a day. And it was the corruption that ended up being the downfall of the Afghan National Army in the end.
Well, Sean, I understand you're running for the Senate in the Republican Party in Pennsylvania, my home state. Is that correct?
Yes, in the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the motto of our campaign is win Pennsylvania, save America. I think that the Democrats, Mark, they know that there's no pathway to the majority.
Well, listen, before I'm cut off by a hard break, I want to make sure I say this loud and clear to my fellow Pennsylvanians. I strongly endorse Sean Parnell for the Republican nomination and the general election to the United States Senate. We need you very, very badly. And between now and May of next year, Sean, we'll have you on several times, my brother. Thank you for your service.